Now, Ukraine finds itself grappling with critical setbacks as the war with Russia escalates into its most perilous phase yet. The Russian forces are advancing at their fastest pace since the 2022 invasion, pushing Ukrainian troops to retreat and also exposing some severe vulnerabilities in Kiev's military operations. And our next report gets more details.
Ukraine's military is under mounting pressure. Supplies are dwindling, desertions are rising. Along the eastern front lines, Russia is rapidly gaining ground. In the Donbas region, Russia claims capturing yet another village. Lethal firepower and relentless assaults are forcing Ukraine to cede territory. Adding to Ukraine's woes, Western arms supplies are dwindling, and domestic weapon production is mired in corruption and inefficiency. Reports indicate Ukraine is recalling 100,000 mortar shells amid investigations into faulty ammunition. The manpower crisis is perhaps the most alarming challenge. Desertions are rising, with tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers abandoning their posts, exhausted and demoralized. This growing problem is weakening Ukraine's ability to sustain its defense, leaving the military stretched thin during critical operations. Those on the front lines are digging in deep to hold back the Russian assault.
Those crews who are close to the front line, as we can see, they have to take a lot of risks. Because this is not the same war as it was in 2022. There are a lot of drones, and the Russians themselves are hunting, especially for medics.
For most people, it simply comes down to character. I mean, to drop everything and run away, and what is the sense of this? Because tomorrow they, the Russians, will be at our homes. You take your inspiration with the fact that you have family, etc., and defending civilians.
Russian airstrikes are targeting energy facilities across Ukraine, causing widespread damage and triggering nationwide air raid alerts, causing death and destruction.
In a couple of minutes, it was shot down. It was so strong that it seemed to me that the house jumped 10 meters up. Everything started to fall apart. My wife put the child on the floor, covered the child with a blanket. Windows started to shatter all over the house.
Ukraine's military chief says dozens of battles took place along the front lines and the situation remains tense, with the fiercest fighting concentrated in the Kurakov and Pokrovsk direction. Experts say the road ahead looks increasingly fraught for Kyiv. Bureau Report, WION World is One.
All right, now to give us more perspective in terms of what is happening at this moment in the Ukraine war, we're being joined by Professor Peter Kuznick, who's a professor of history and director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at the American University. He's joining us live on this broadcast. Now, Professor Kuznick, thank you very much indeed, sir, for taking time out and speaking to us. And let me, in fact, start off by asking you this. Now, this is a very crucial phase of this war. And besides the obvious problem of ammunition, Ukraine seems to be bothered with a much bigger problem, and that is of manpower. And now there are reports that are coming forth that there are a lot of Ukrainian soldiers who are also deserting and just fleeing from their positions. Do you think there's anything that the West can actually do to try to make good on the desertions that Ukrainian army at this moment is witnessing?
Well, the French in particular have talked about sending French troops to Ukraine, but that would be very, very dangerous and unpopular in France. There's nothing that the West can do to replace Ukrainian troops who are deserting in very, very large numbers. The estimates are that at least 100,000 Ukrainians have already deserted, and that number might be as high as 200,000. You combine that with the number of Ukrainians who have left the country, somewhere between 10 and 20 million have left Ukraine, and you put that together with the fact that the latest polling inside Ukraine shows that a majority of Ukrainians would rather end the war and give up land that the Russians now control rather than continue the fighting. So I think what we're seeing is an across-the-board demoralization or a recognition that this is an unwinnable war, and that to continue fighting, to use these young men and older men as cannon fodder, just to be put out there to be slaughtered. The Ukrainians, the soldiers themselves, don't want to be in that position. And I think most Ukrainians now realize that this might have been a gallant effort, but it's no longer worth continuing.
You know, the morale within the Ukrainian army could be low because of the desertions that we are looking at, but the morale in the White House does not seem to be low at all, even though Joe Biden is counting out his last days as the lame duck president. Now, what we've been witnessing the last couple of weeks is that he has sanctioned the Ukrainians to go ahead and use long-range weapons to strike targets inside of the Russian territory, for which the Russians have responded by saying that, listen, we can hit back with much greater force. In your assessment, what do you think is Joe Biden's strategy as he counts out his final days at the White House here?
I don't think that Joe Biden is lucid enough to have anything we would call a strategy anymore. What he's trying to do is give Ukraine as much weaponry and as much money as possible before Donald Trump takes over. He wants to box Trump in as much as he possibly can, but is using the Ukrainians as, you know, the cannon fodder for that effort. And I think the Ukrainians have had it. In the United States, there's a growing weariness, as there is in Europe, with continuing to fight a war that is futile. Not only futile, the Russians have already won in every meaningful sense. The Ukrainians are outmanned, outgunned, outmaneuvered. So what we're left with is a tragedy of people giving up their lives or their limbs for something that they know they can't win. It doesn't make any sense.
But if you look at what the decision makers in the White House seem to be at this moment talking about, if you were to go by that report that emerged in the New York Times, where it said that one of the officials perhaps indicated to Joe Biden that the United States could give nuclear weapons to Ukraine for long-term credible deterrence against Russia, so that Ukraine does not have to suffer the fate that it currently suffers. Do you think the United States at all would consider giving the Ukrainians any kind of nuclear weapons, as was indicated in that New York Times report, which happens to be a paper of record for the United States?
Well, you have to remember that report came out 8 days ago, and that paragraph, one paragraph, was buried at the end of a long article, and the sources were anonymous, because nobody in their right mind would consider giving Ukraine nuclear weapons at this point. I mean, we're talking about weapons that the Russians would never tolerate, that the Russians would destroy before they were usable, and that would, if anything, likely trigger a nuclear World War III. Giving them the permission to use the ATACMS inside Russia, the Russians have responded with massive attacks, destroying Ukrainian infrastructure, the energy grid, but also with the Reshnik missiles. This is a hypersonic intermediate range missile that cannot be shot down. And they already destroyed the first targets in Ukraine, and they've got more and more of these that they can use. And they have multiple warheads. They can actually carry nuclear warheads. The Russians signaled to the United States that they weren't going to use nuclear warheads, but Russia has also lowered its nuclear threshold. They signed new nuclear policies that make it much easier, not only against Ukraine, but against any nuclear power that supports Ukraine in its attacks on Russia. And so the whole thing is, you know, and even the American experts, when they announced the ATACMS that they were being used, the American experts all said, too little, too late. So why should we risk nuclear war over a policy that we know is going to fail? That's not going to make any difference on the battlefield.
I think you've summed it up very comprehensively there. We're completely out of time. Thank you very much indeed, Professor Kuznick, for joining us with that perspective there. For all the latest news, download the WION app and subscribe to our YouTube channel.